My favorite thing was that Ben Schott said this. He was moaning on Twitter this week in the aftermath of this article, which was headlined "Give Amazon and Facebook a seat at the United Nations." And he was moaning on Twitter about how, he wished people would remember that, journalists and columnists rarely write their own headlines, which
Mhm.
is, of course, true. But Ben Schott is literally calling for like Apple and Amazon to be members of the United Nations. I don't understand what
I love
like
that
what
he
he's
he
bitching
argues for
about.
that even after, Frances Hagen or Haugen, the, whistleblower, kind of revealed her information over the past couple of days and how horrifying the practices within Facebook are. And here we have someone advocating for them to have a seat at
Mhm. On the same
at
week.
that table. So
At the
that's
same
great.
week.
That's great.
Let's identify, these processes that have brought corporate power on scale with the state, as Ben Schott is doing in this article. But then let's embrace it. Let's accelerate that process towards its logical conclusion.
The whole concept of making Facebook a nation state to me is just terrifying. So
Right, right, and I think probably where we're headed anyway, civilizationally, and so to see it pop up, in the mouth of someone whose life is as stakeless and as meaningless as the advertising and brands columnist for Bloomberg,
oh
Ben
yeah.
Schott.
Yeah.
Like, think
No, I
about
know.
think
I
about the
know.
type of person who holds those titles. Think about who you must be to be the advertising and brands columnist. There's a subheading. The penultimate subheading in this column, I shit you not, is called Lebensraum, as a play on words with the right-wing German notion of Lebensraum, which means living space, which was notably the ideology that led to genocide in Eastern Europe.
Mhm.
Lebensraum. These people, there is nothing that means anything in these people's lives.
No.
Nothing. There
No,
are
not at all.
no stakes, and they're just pissing down on us.
So Ben Schott, Bloomberg's opinions, advertising and brands columnist, admitted that civilization should take the brakes off its long slide into neo feudalism by just letting Amazon and Apple into the United Nations.
And this is one of these columns that's almost satire, right? And yet, I can see a near future where, like, a key difference between a progressive and a liberal is that the former thinks Amazon and Apple should be in the United Nations, while a liberal wants every top 10 multinational to have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council.
So the article quotes here. Take the current global chip crisis. Nowadays, the ever increasing tracks of the world economy rely on the pure wafer foundry market, of which 55% is controlled by the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Not only does the TSMC pick which businesses get the chips they need and which countries get its new fab factories, the company's leadership has warned nation states against competitive onshoring and advised China not to invade.
The shot goes on, quoting now from the TSMC's chairman. As to an invasion by China, Mark Liu said, let me tell you, everyone wants to have a peaceful Taiwan Strait because it's to every country's benefit, but also because the semiconductor supply chain in Taiwan, no one wants to disrupt it.
Schott continues, if this all sounds a tad whimsical, comparing gadflies to Goliaths, it may be because of the cultural dominance of the Westphalian system under which the global balance of power has been envisioned. since 1648 as a mosaic of centrally controlled and culturally unified nation states, each wielding a monopoly of force inside mutually recognized borders.
And he did, in fact, just say that the potential for the Taiwan Strait to become the site of a hot conflict with mainland China was a tad whimsical. Is that I honestly I can't tell if that's an intentional joke here. Is he being flip? I don't. So what Schott is evoking here, the Westphalian system, is a reference to the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War and which established a system of state power, which essentially didn't get rearranged until after the Second World War, right? And largely the world order that exists today is the one that was founded on the Westphalian system. To this,
Yeah.
it was not a
Yeah.
meaningful departure; it was a redefinition. And what what it is at its most basic level is just the idea that the world is comprised of states which are legitimate and control the interests and resources and peoples within their borders, right? And this is
Mhm.
something we kind of take for granted, right?
Right.
But you in 1648 you don't have a world of nation states the way that we have now, right? And it's sort of because of this system that you end up with the world that does have, a divided interest between competing realist nation states and their interests. And so when we talk about, neo feudalism, we really are talking about sort of the disassembling of the Westphalian peace and a return to a messier definition of official and authoritative power.
It's fascinating to me because, we have people here advocating for putting these private entities on the table and, they would be in the circumstances the only nation states in quotation marks that quite literally transcend political boundaries and borders and all of that.
Right.
So immediately you can make an argument that those said new nation states become more powerful, like, than other
Right.
ones on the table, like, in those circumstances, because they don't have to abide by boundaries. They don't. They're confined to the planet, and that's about it.
Right. And in the article, Schott goes as far as to um, point out this that many multinational corporate interests are larger and more powerful than lots of states, right? And I think that what it's easy to imagine, is a near future where it is Malaysia brought to you by Amazon, right? And that you end up with states that end up within the almost imperial portfolios of these multinationals, right? The Papua New Guinea sponsored by ExxonMobil, right? That these would be sort of
The
the
American debt ceiling sponsored by Amazon.
well, if only. But yeah. And so that's the sort of the thing that Ben Schott is playfully, whimsically even toying with here, right? Is that, right? And I think that you would have to, you know, be the most obtuse and naive, type of person to just sort of bandy this about in the way that Ben Schott is doing here.
So, Schott continues, external defense and internal assistance have historically been the province of developed nation states. Earthquakes, outbreaks, hurricanes, heat waves, floods, fires, insurrections, and invasions demand a scale of command and control typically available only to state military and civil agencies.
COVID-19 tested this truism, even in the most advanced nations, both because of the pandemic's unprecedented global impact and because the highly specialized responses it required could only be provided expeditiously by brands. And lest we forget, the flag of McDonald's Corp still flutters proudly over Gitmo.
The Obama playbook, as he continues here, of a branded content second act beyond books and speeches. will inevitably attract a new cohort of youthful former statesmen keen to wield soft power and earn small fortunes, unfettered by orthodox gatekeepers. On quitting the royal family, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle lost no time in establishing their own indie shop, Archwell Productions, inking copycat deals with Netflix and Spotify, and collaborating on an Apple TV series with the brand powerhouse Oprah Winfrey.
There's a veritable pipeline right now, of not just legislators to lobbyists, right? But heads of state now, planning their
It's a big club
afterwards.
and we ain't in it.
Right. And if you're Barack Obama, right, you know, and you want to be a socialite, you want to ink book deals and rub shoulders with all these people, after you become president. Well, then you might set the same policy agendas that the Obama administration set, and have a similar set of motives and desires about what you're willing to do for the public. To return to our play on words with Lebensraum, the German right wing notion of living space in Eastern Europe, I suppose that may very well have been written by by an editor, right? Like that subheading could have been put in there by an editor, but that's assuming that's the only thing that you think is wrong with this article is that is is that. But anyway, so Schott continues here. Uh, as the earth floods, burns, chokes, and shakes, so Atlas shrugs, and the world's richest brand leaders set a course for Planet B as a place to dump heavy industry, lure tourists, and escape the thin air of tax and regulation.
He continues, the United Nations currently grants observer status to some 120 intergovernmental organizations and specialized agencies, from the Sovereign Order of Malta to the International Seabed Authority. Doubtless, these bodies do admirable work, but is the Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean vastly more vital to global democracy than Twitter Incorporated? Or the International Telecommunication Union, more unifying of international telecoms than Google? And if such brands might be granted observer status, why not full membership? That's
Right. This is the
that's great.
kicker.
Thanks, man. Thanks.
Well, and it's like it's a complete like like an uncritical acceptance of the NGO thing, right? It's like the argument is there to be made that your human rights NGOs, humanitarian NGOs, and these structures, right, are the intermediaries between us and the future that we've kind of and that Ben Schott is describing. Clearly, they are, right? That on your way to neo-feudalism, right, you have these non-government entities that begin to exercise power at international structures, right? Like I accept that. That's a critique of NGOism, which is a term that we use on the left to sort of describe what's happened to neoliberalism since the 1970s. Is this tide of NGOism has, as Schott points out here, brought lots of non-governmental organizations
Yeah.
to exercise significant and meaningful power within the halls of our international structures. Of course, this also serves as a check on the types of change that we can see, because these not NGOs, what they do is they make sure that all of the humanitarian and human rights related uh, efforts are all channeled through capital donations to these institutions, right? And so
Yeah.
the mouthpiece, the fulcrum for human rights and humanitarian progress becomes these um, essentially charitable non-governmental organizations, which are
Mhm.
appendages of capital, right? Which
Yeah.
and there's plenty of adages about the difference between charity and change and revolution, right? And that
Right.
that
Right.
charity usually tends to be carried out by the people who are profiting from the very misery that charity seeks to alleviate.
It's fun to talk about neo feudalism as we are a mere 17 days away from the release of the neo feudalistic, that's a word, science fiction epic
Also, if we're looking for sci-fi to read related to the things that we've been talking about in the first part of this episode, I would really recommend the Mars trilogy as well. It's a Hugo Award winning series from the early '90s.
And for our listeners, we will be covering and reviewing um, Dune here in a couple of weeks before it comes out, or when it comes
Yeah,
out. Sorry.
we're definitely gonna sort of talk about it and react to it a little bit. Um, the Mars trilogy is by Kim Stanley Robinson, right? The three books in it, and it's a really nice imagining of these exact processes projected precisely where Ben Schott is talking about them, right? When Schott is sort of gesturing at SpaceX and these aspirational projects of capital right now, that's a series that really explores both that and the processes of transnational corporate power and their usurpation of the state and international organizations and institutions. What we're going to do here in this part of the episode is address Havana syndrome. And we've got a little bit about sort of what we've been reading this week in relation to Havana syndrome. We're going to sort of overview that, and then we're going to move into some discussion, right? We're going to sort of debate the sort of theoretical and practical possibility of the technology that is allegedly related to the Havana syndrome. And then we're gonna kind of talk about the implications of it beyond just what's been written about it so far.
For those of you guys that haven't heard of this subject before, we should start off with a little bit of background. I want to sort of preface the storyline with a very recent article that was published on September 28th by the Wall Street Journal. So the journal reports that at some point within the past several weeks, the CIA, God bless them, evacuated an intelligence officer who had been operating in Serbia. He had experienced injuries and symptoms heavily associated with this so called Havana syndrome. His poor soul getting attacked by unseen forces while conducting espionage for the American Empire. But let's dive more into what this Havana syndrome actually is.
The condition refers to a bizarre, unexplained group of medical symptoms that were first reported by U.S. State Department staff in Cuba around late 2016. It was around this time period that U.S. diplomats who were conducting state business in the country began to experience the now telltale symptoms of Havana syndrome. The symptoms include dizziness, severe headaches, rapid onset of fatigue, anxiety episodes, and extreme cognitive difficulties like short term memory loss. Pretty weird.
Definitely. So, Havana syndrome found its roots in Cuba, as we've established during late 2016. In terms of potentially earlier cases, well, we don't have really much else known evidence of that in terms of what's been reported in the mainstream press. The Wall Street Journal did report in 2018, however, that a U.S. diplomat in China experienced very similar symptoms to those that were reported in Cuba.
Yeah. And this particular case is interesting because the State Department literally describes this Chinese diplomat having suffered from a serious brain injury as a result of whatever was causing this condition. And this particular diplomat had been experienced months of highly abnormal aural sensations, as described by the Wall Street Journal and the State Department.
And interestingly, this particular individual started reporting these symptoms as early as late 2017. At the time, the lovely Mr. Mike Pompeo, then Secretary of State, testified before Congress that that this case had extreme resemblance to the cases originally reported in Cuba.
The US and Chinese governments were totally incapable of determining the source of this particular incident after investigation.
And to really top this all off, CIA Director William Burns ventured to India in September, and one of his own staff members experienced Havana like symptoms. That individual did receive medical attention and treatment as a result. It has also been reported that Vice President Kamala Harris had to temporarily delay her arrival to Vietnam because of a quote, possible anomalous health incident in Hanoi.
Things get even more weird because we have Director Burns in an interview with NPR saying there are probably a couple hundred incidents across the US government and across the globe. Of those couple of hundred, there's probably about 100 in which my colleagues, my officers, and family members have been affected.
The Journal of the American Medical Association published articles in 2018 and 2019. That was the first to argue that the most likely source of these symptoms was a device that emitted a radio signal.
In December of 2020, a US government panel of scientists concluded the attacks were most likely the result of a highly directed pulsed energy attack.
And this panel was referring specifically to the evidence that has appeared in Cuba and China, just only those cases, those countries. The study was actually published by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. So it's a pretty serious scientific journal right there making this claim. The scientists identified, quote, directed pulse radio frequency energy, or RF energy, as the most likely explanation for Havana syndrome. It's pretty staggering.
This same panel concluded that theory was far more probable than, quote, inadvertent or environmental exposure, but more research would be needed,
And like clockwork at the time, former President Donald Trump blamed Cuba for the incidents, and Cuba immediately denied any wrongdoing.
which shouldn't surprise us one bit.
Right. So, anyways, the same scientific panel also examined a variety of other potential theories behind Havana syndrome. They looked at exposure to different chemicals, infectious diseases, and other potential psychosocial factors. Even after all of that, they still concluded these symptoms were most likely the result of radio frequency energy exposure. It's pretty wild.
The New Yorker reported in May of 2021 that US government investigators were working under the notion that these attacks were indeed being perpetrated by a foreign state. The leading candidate for that role was Moscow's military intelligence service.
And investigators were wondering if Russian operatives were aiming microwave devices of some kind at US spies and diplomats in an attempt to collect data from electronic equipment like computers and phones.
To really top all of this off, there was even an incident in November of 2020 that affected a senior official of the NSC who had been sitting in his office at the Eisenhower Executive Building. This senior official got up to leave and exited. As he was walking through the parking lot nearby to his car, he began to notice a very significant ringing in his ears. His body apparently went numb, and he started to have noticeable difficulty controlling movement of his upper and lower extremities. He even began to slur his speech when he tried to speak with someone nearby. The symptoms were reported to have come on all of a sudden.
And that's exactly how one might expect symptoms to arise from some kind of directed energy attack instead of a gradual thing.
Right. I think it's been evident in a lot of this reporting that these incidents sort of came out of nowhere and definitely caused symptoms in a rapid fashion.
So eventually, this same senior official on the National Security Council would find his way to a doctor shortly after the symptoms arose. Numerous medical tests were administered, an MRI was performed, and blood tests were conducted. Nothing unusual turned up. About 2 hours later, the individual speech began to return.
We've been referencing an article from the New Yorker written by Adam Intus. Mr. Intus wrote an article with John Lee Anderson for the New Yorker, published in November of 2018. This particular article focused on the first incidents of Havana syndrome that were reported in Cuba in late 2016, as we previously mentioned. The diplomats and spies affected during this particular series of events reported feeling that they had been, quote, bombarded by waves of pressure in their heads. Some said they heard sounds resembling an immense swarm of cicadas following them from room to room, and when they opened a door to the outside, the sounds abruptly stopped. A few reported feeling as if they were standing in an invisible beam of energy, end quote.
And get this, after these events, these folks reported having severe headaches, tendinitis, vision loss, hearing difficulty, memory loss, and sudden inability to find their balance and walk correctly or use their hands properly.
But some have begun to push back against what they consider an argument founded in pseudoscience. Robert Below at UCLA and Robert Bartholomew from the University of Auckland published a book in 2020 which argued that the set of symptoms associated with Havana syndrome can be mostly explained as mass psychogenic illness. Part of the reason that we want to talk about this week is because Congress passed a bill allotting funds, particularly for the healthcare of people who have been um, affected by this group of symptoms, which currently has very little scientific basis outside of the State Department. Um, and I wanted to kind of start with that sort of dissonance of all of the things that the state can't do, right? All of the things that we can't do for the public, right? But when it's time to help 100 CIA operatives who have headaches and upset tummies, we can get Congress to act just like that. And that was what sort of brought this back into the news this week. That's why you might have been hearing about it, and we're here to sort of dive in a little bit to our interests regarding this particular story.
So I just want to start off by saying I think the whole thing is really fucking weird. Number one, okay, like I'm going to argue, and this is what how I truly feel about this mystery. Um, I want to just say this, I'm in no shape or form a qualified psychologist or psychiatrist. But the mass psychogenic illness sort of like theory to me, I don't know. Maybe I should probably read the book before I just sort of outright attack what they're arguing there. But like we have, a large US government sponsored scientific panel that is concluding based on the evidence at the time, not long ago, and not much has changed since then. This panel is arguing that this is some kind of radio frequency microwave energy burst that's targeted at these individuals, which implies, that it's either the US government doing something on its own citizens, basically, or it's another organization, private entity somewhere else, or a foreign state actor that's perpetrating this. So, like, we have this buildup over time, and that's been the narrative going forth until like just recently, because now we have the U.S. government. I think it was the Pentagon earlier, maybe over the weekend when they released this, basically concluding that Havana syndrome was most likely caused by crickets. Crickets.
Yeah, I'd read
That
that.
was the official explanation, was that like crickets were, the noises that crickets were making caused these insane, batshit insane symptoms to occur,
Mhm.
which is ludicrous to me. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
That
I
is
remember that
that
phase of
is
the story.
covering your own ass. So, like,
Well, I think that what what stands out to me about the mass psychogenic illness argument is that it's an argument that actually anticipates that these types of things would be experienced by a conspicuously related group of people, right? And the a lot of the argument a lot of the argument that's being made by Below and Bartholomew in their 2020 book Havana Syndrome is going back through and looking at the characterization of these symptoms, right? That there has not been in any of these cases, these more anecdotal, more interesting cases, there has not been documented interest of something as extreme as brain damage, right? Or any evidence of long-term effects of
Right.
this experience, right? And the history of mass psychogenic illness goes all like and I mean that's what we call it now, right? But it goes into antiquity, right? Particularly in the context of war in the battlefield and moments of high trauma, right? There's a reason that for the Romans that Mars was the god of war, but Phobos ruled the battlefield, right? And so this attitude that in moments of high stress, right, particularly in the context of war, right, that people are very very susceptible to these types of suggestions, and sometimes it can be as simple as like seeing the platoon next to you get mustard gassed, and even though you're not being like affected by
Yeah.
it, you start
Yeah.
coughing and throwing up and all this, which is pretty common, right? There's like this is well attested
Mhm.
in these conditions of high stress. And so that's being presented as an alternative to what is, and this is what Below and Bartholomew spend a lot of the book working on, this sort of presentation of these anecdotes, right? Which
Mhm.
is distinct from the presentation of um, like a long running symptom or anything
Yeah.
related to it, right?
Yeah.
And so everyone who has written about the theoretical technology that would be required to pull this off, right? Um, you know, everyone who's tried to solve for X on the technology that would make this make sense has said it's impossible, right? It's highly speculative, and furthermore, that it would be a massive undertaking for a state to harness
Sure.
power, which is highly speculative in the mainstream scientific community, and deploy it in embassies in Havana, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That it's that part of it, right? It's the idea
Mhm.
that Russia or China has deployed all of the resources that would be necessary to harness this tag, and all they're getting for it are stomach aches and headaches and
Mhm.
things which, as Below and Bartholomew have pointed out for us, don't rise to the level of any long term, damage, right, or evidence that an
Yeah.
interaction with that device ever would have occurred.
I get what they're saying, in what you were talking about in events of high stress, people do this, as you were just saying. But like my sort of question for that line of thinking in relation to this specific topic is like, are people in high stress, environments necessarily in some of these cases? I mean, like for example, the guy who was just on the National Security Council who just basically got up to leave work one day. Just his just normal job. Just got up to leave work and was just walking through the parking lot. And all of a sudden, boom, symptoms just started out of nowhere. And I think it was reported too that this was like a young, healthy guy, like in his mid 30s, in the article. So I don't know.
I
But
think that I'm actually kind of open to the idea that the work done by embassy officials and certainly Intelcom operatives, especially in an embassy like one in Havana,
oh, sure, sure.
that this is a deeply contested space, right? That it
Yeah.
is a
Okay.
stressful, environment, and I think that there's that to say about it, but that there's also I have a deep suspicion that a significant chunk of the people who have experienced these symptoms, are people who do some hard stuff, right?
Mhm.
People who uh, are the water carriers for a imperialist system of sanctions that
Mhm.
has oppressed the island of Cuba for over half a century,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
as you walk the streets of Havana, as the architects and planners of that project, that the subconscious mind probably does identify your place in that. But the conscious mind, right? The one that went to Harvard and passed the all of the tests you have to pass to be a diplomat or work in the State Department, etc. Right? That part of the mind, um, you know, can't acknowledge it, but subconsciously, it's very possible for um, these types of symptoms, to originate from people who who just don't have what it takes to drink it away like a Cold War CIA operative might have 70 years ago or something like
Right.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. There's a part of me that does think there's like absolutely no way that like mid 20th century CIA operatives would ever be like, my tummy hurts. It's the Russians. Like I just like it. Like there is just and I mean we can chalk that up to a lot of
Oh, it's
things.
a
None
stereotype
of
that exists
none of
there.
them right, and none of them healthy, right? I'm not
Right. Right.
advocating alcoholism and the types of things that drove CIA operatives in the center of the Cold War, but
Oh,
I am
yeah.
just saying that it is like conspicuously, like it, it's almost the manifestation of people who have very much like convinced themselves consciously
Mhm.
that what they're doing is good,
Yeah.
right? But which even a kernel of doubt, right, would um would be enough, right?
Sure.
Now, with all of this laid out, you cannot have mass psychogenic illness without an original stimulation, right? That I think that the problem and where the mass psychogenic illness argument comes up short is in terms of there still has to be somewhere a first symptom, right? A symptom that probably isn't psychogenic, right? But which gets reported to other people in this high stress environment. And that's why you end up with 100 people, who all know each other with this same symptom, right? Not because there are zero cases that are interesting, but because the majority of them are being spread sort of through these psychogenic vectors, right? And so what this suggests though is that there there's an origin point of this that is still
Yeah.
complicated and still mysterious, even if you buy the mass psychogenic illness argument
Mhm.
about Havana syndrome.
The argument to me that the technology needed to do this and to pull it off is, as you were saying, or as other people were saying, is far too speculative, crazy. It's too advanced for it to, for another nation state or even our own to pull it off. And as we have previously covered on this show, like I don't think that's a legitimate argument to say that it's impossible for something like this to exist because conventional science does not say that something like this could exist. And the reason I say that is because over the past 3 to 4 years now, we have watched the mainstream press basically confirm the existence of highly exotic, physics defying technology whipping around through American airspace and toying with pilots, um, jamming radar, and doing all kinds of insane stuff. And it's very well documented. This is no longer just anecdotal reports from military pilots. This is like highly, highly, highly multi-sensory data confirming these anecdotal stories that are absolutely wild. And so, now we have confirmation that technology existing beyond our wildest dreams is not something that is totally, out of the realm of possibility.
That
And
it's
so,
possible that it's possible, especially through the private public nexus of the military
right, right, exactly.
to hide these types of things, right?
Yes.
And so the tendency, I think the knee jerk reaction, to say, oh, but but how, and why, right? Is a reaction that is built on certain assumptions about the capacity of the state and capital to
Yeah.
carry out these types of super secret, um, projects related
Yeah.
to high tech, right? And I'm amenable to that. I think that if we're gonna react and incorporate, that story, the UAP
Mhm.
story, into our worldview, that's how we do it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's the more I think about this particular story in what we just sort of went over there, like, let's sort of contend for a second that this is the result of some sort of highly exotic technology being used, on American and I think Canadian diplomats. Let's sort of speculate upon that. Why? Because the point being that we just made earlier, that the fact that these folks are only experiencing those symptoms, and they're very temporary. Even though they're very severe within the time frame they happen, they're
Right.
very short lived. Okay, so we'll say that's happening. So what is like, what's the end game there? Why, if it's deliberate and it's not mass psychogenic illness,
Right.
what in the world is the reason for doing it? And I the only thing I can come up with is the one of the original theories that it just happens to be a byproduct of, you know, foreign state or whoever trying to gather information, of electronic equipment, and whatever technology they're using, the people around it, are being affected by it, and that's the byproduct of these clandestine activities and stuff like that. Okay. And I'm sort of saying that, like, through the lens of suggesting, like, that particular theory, saying that through the lens of
Mhm.
suggesting that it's a foreign state actor like Russia or China or
Right.
whatever. The other side to this, which is to me a little bit more sinister, is that this is, you know, an aspect of the US military industrial intelligence complex
Right.
that is experimenting upon people and utilizing technology. Because to me, that would explain why, if we're going to contend that it's deliberate again, that would explain why, you know, we're just seeing these attacks happen and they're short lived and that's it, and then we're not seeing what the in game, what the product at the end of all of this is, because it's just a bunch of, fucking scientists and black programs gathering data on how this technology, affects people and stuff like that. But then you that just opens up, just a whole other line of questions. Why are you testing it on U.S. diplomats and U.S. spies? I don't know. Maybe because it's possible that, okay, maybe this is the perfect group of people to test it on, because there's, if we do this well,
Because they keep their mouths
then
shut.
they keep their mouths shut. But look, but it works in a way, because look at what we're doing right now. There's a million theories that
Right.
people have speculated upon
Right.
for why this is going on to these specific people. And so it gives them a little bit of cover
Mhm.
if they wanted to do this, because they start doing it well, the rest of the world's going to speculate it's Russia or China, or it's mass psychogenic illness.
Right. So I
So,
think that this is an interesting perspective to take on it, and I think that uh, it actually folds relatively neatly into the mass psychogenic illness argument, because the suggestion that some sort of um, test might have been some sort of black site or black box program of the intelligence community might have been carried out on even a willing operative, right?
yeah.
Could be sort of your real uh, set of symptoms that then are talked about, right? Communicated through that they're leaked in some way to diplomats, to uh, people in operatives in Havana who don't have the clearance to know about that program or whatever. They hear about just this guy who had experienced these symptoms, and they start to speculate, right? And they start to come up with their own theories and all this sort of stuff. And meanwhile, the people directing this program, right, the people who you know uh irradiated the head of some CIA operative, and somehow his symptoms got out, right? That is the source of the psychogenic illness, right? And once you've convinced, normal diplomats who think they're good people and CIA operatives who don't have super high clearance or whatever. Once you've convinced, these people that there's a brain melting ray gun out there that's going to get you and your
Yeah.
loved ones, right? That's plenty. I mean,
Mhm.
that's for people to say, oh, I mean, if you told me that my coworkers were dropping ill with potentially
Mhm.
with some strange ray gun device or whatever, I might head home early for the day. I might I might start to feel kind of queasy.
The more I sort of contend with it, I think it's entirely possible that, this could very well be, um, mass psychogenic illness, which is fascinating in and of itself.
And still leaves the underlying question, right?
Yeah.
Of what was the case zero
Right. Right.
for that mass psychogenic
Yeah.
illness, right?
But I mean, if it's not that, because when we talk about like mass hallucinatory, that's a word, hallucinatory, sort of illnesses, like even in psychology and stuff like that, there's not a lot of sort of evidence for that sort of stuff to be
Hmm.
a legitimate thing because it goes back to, and not to get too spooky, but like there's there are certain topics that exist in in within the human species and experiences and things like that. Like, I guess what I'm getting at here is when people there are several subjects of study that exist, that document the large treasure trove of people experiencing the same thing, basically, and it forming a narrative, and people trying to throw the argument against that, saying it's mass hallucination, whatever. Because mass hallucination would fall under that category, mass
Hmm.
psychogenic illness. It's the same thing. Okay.
Yeah,
And
I
so,
I see the similarity. I do think it is different. I think the idea of everyone
mm,
hallucinating the same thing visually at the same time, right, is different because we do
then
know that, like,
auditory and what they're getting at here.
right, and
Right,
like
right.
like you can convince yourself that you have a stomach ache or a headache, right? You can
Mm,
think your way into those
right, which is,
conditions,
yeah, exactly. And so, that this is like, this particular thing is slightly different than what I was just sort of
Mhm.
arguing, but I'm just saying that,
Sure.
is it possible that, we're these are those two things are closer than what we think,
Right.
and I don't know.
I don't think
I
it's an
I
accident that you're having that reaction.
mhm,
And I think the reason, and this is sort of why we've been sort of treading this path, is because these things have the features and qualities of high strangeness, right?
they do. Yeah.
That something here, um, you know, seems amiss, right? Because
Yeah.
because
It's
none of
fishy.
the motives of the actors make any sense, right?
Mhm.
And none of the resulting effects necessarily make any sense.
Right.
And a lot of times when that happens, and especially when it happens when we're talking about UAPs, people will usually try to discount the evidence in that topic in a
Yeah.
similar way to the way they're trying to discount a lot of this information
Mhm.
about Havana syndrome.
Yeah.
Um, I do want to and to
It's
maybe
weird, the more I think about it, even as we talk about this, like, on this podcast, it makes even less sense for this. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'll go ahead and say it anyways. It makes even less sense for this to be like a state actor from somewhere else doing this. Because I mean, yeah, let's say it's Russia or somebody trying to gather data from electronic equipment, as we were saying. And again, this is just a byproduct of it. Like, sure, I guess that's entirely possible, but it's happening on such a global scale.
Well,
And
and why would you need to invent that technology for that purpose? You know what I'm
right.
saying? Like, there's a lot of ways to get stuff off people's
Yeah,
computers,
I mean,
right?
we just learned about how what was the name of the Russian hacker group that had basically sat in like Pentagon servers for months
Right,
gathering data, that
right,
like
right. It,
that just happened, and
the idea that that's because I think that
yeah.
thing about oh no they're using some experimental something where you terrestrially uh point a device at a certain location. I mean, it's like Bonneville and stuff. It's like the way people thought stuff would work before the internet existed. Like, like if you if before you could conceptualize computers being connected, this is the type of thing that you might
Yeah,
like say. But anyway, and so I think that like has sort of the markers of a good explanation, right?
sure.
Of being very reasonable, but yet it's not solving the central issue
Yeah,
of of the why, of the how and the why
yeah,
of the two things. But I wanted to maybe put us over the line here by then saying that as interesting as this is, right? Um, the Our legislature has allocated money to, I don't know, buy these people a bottle of Tums or something, for their medical care or something, and that's happening. We've got uh, you know indigenous people in the American West who can't access, healthcare,
oh,
right?
yeah,
And we're you know buying $10,000 bottles of Tums and an aspirin
spies.
for spies who have. But anyway, so and I think that like on that level, um, I I have a really hard time caring a whole lot about
Mhm.
about these folks, right?
Yeah,
Amid all the rest of the debate, it's just
we're
it's an
here for the
example of
story,
right, right.
that's
Well, and it's an example of sort of who the world works for,
yeah,
and
yeah,
who how things happen, and the fact that the the types of solutions, the types of things that our political systems can do. It's that kind of
mhm,
stuff, right? It's
yeah.
like it's a group of 100 people with a stomach ache getting their healthcare paid for. This is an independently produced podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at COINTELPROPOD and support more of our work on our Patreon page. The link is in the show notes and in our Twitter bio. We'll see you next week on COINTELPRO.